what designers should focus on is less so what players are saying and more of how they are feeling.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so let's talk about 3 different approaches to design: genre design, evolutionary design, and revolutionary design. Genre design is all about paying off player expectations. When you come to a genre, any given genre, something like 2D platformer or first-person shooter, players are going to have built-in expectations for what those types of games are. Genre is probably the most restricted design mindset, which is, here's something that are like a category that already exists, and I am going to understand and internalize the tropes of that genre completely. I'm going to pay them off and meet the player's expectations in the way that they are expecting me to do so. A genre game that like pays off the idea of genre design is something like Celeste, maybe, right? Like it's a 2D platformer. Yeah. It's a very good one, but it is still in the entire lineage of 2D platforming. As far as I know, there might be a twist somewhere, but...
no, I've actually just been playing Celeste.
Oh, great.
So,
okay. Yeah. 2D platformer pays off the genre expectations.
Right. Even if it does its own thing like slightly differently.
Oh, right? Of course. Yeah. It can have sort of innovations on movement and things, but like a 2D platformer is there's platforms and I jump between them and there's different abilities that I get. Like it's still paying off all those tropes. An evolutionary design mindset, and this I would say is 80% the same and 20% different, right? Where you're taking a genre or you're taking an idea, something that players might be at least somewhat familiar with, and you're changing it at least 20%. And this is usually the like default mode. I guess I could say for most design thinking is 80% the same, 20% different, because this is usually what's pitched as like the thing that most players are comfortable enough with, but also will find enough novelty in that they'll think they'll find it enjoyable. I guess the best example here is probably something like Half-Life, where it's built on the first-person shooter genre, but then adds in this 20% of like being more story driven than a lot of other first-person shooters were at the time, especially when you compared it to something like Doom, right? Where Doom is like quintessential first-person shooter genre. Now we're adding in an additional layer of storytelling.
Sure. Would you say Portal is probably too different?
Portal's revolutionary.
Yeah.
So as we move into like the revolutionary design part of this is something that's like going to be an experience that most of this experience players have never experienced before. Something like The Witness, maybe Monument Valley you could say is revolutionary, and then also Portal. Sometimes you're going to lean on particular control schemes and things that players have internalized, like Portal with first-person shooter controls, but the entirety of the game is not paying off any... basically, if it's more than 20% different, I think I'd probably put it in the revolutionary category.
You don't necessarily have to start with an intention in mind. There's plenty of times that you could end up starting some sort of a game design idea based off a mechanic, based off of a system, based off a narrative, whatever. And then over time, you can start to find that sort of intentionality, right? And with Portal, it's like, did they know it was going to be a first-person shooter? Maybe they thought it was going to be a first-person shooter, but they did this portal gun, and they were like, oh, well, that's the game. That's the game, yeah. So I think that it can definitely be something that you find along the way. But I think that as long as you end up exploring that, like you have to consider it, right, at some point. If you think of it as sort of like going up the chain of decisions, right, of a hierarchy of what's important in the game, you're kind of skipping that underlying like structure, right? The primary theme or intention or goal of what your overall design is going to be. At some point, you're going to have to go back and revisit that and make sure that you're understanding what your overall goal is going to be.
A lot of times we talk about sort of top-down or bottom-up design, right? Where top-down, you're starting with theme, you're starting with story, you're starting with intentionality of experience, or bottom-up, you're starting from mechanics, and then you're finding that sort of mechanical expression and the story that is best told with those mechanics. And either direction's fine as long as you're coming back and finding the totality of that picture, right? And understanding which parts of these you're in, I think can help you do that, right? Like if your intention is, I'm going to design a genre 2D platformer or a first-person shooter or whatever it is, you can think about what the audience's expectations are as you're building that game, right? So, we talked before about what we call the MEAT method, which means marketing, experience, analysis, and takeaways, where the marketing side of this is where you're going to be setting your audience expectations for the type of vision that you've come up with, right? If it's a genre if it's a genre game, right, you're working within 2D platformer or whatever, you're going to set that up in your marketing and make it clear that, hey, this is a 2D platformer. I'm hitting all of the usual tropes that you're used to experiencing. So like if you like other 2D platformers, you'll like this game. Versus if you're in an evolutionary design path, you're going to be showing, okay, here's the 80% of the thing that you're expecting to experience, and here's the 20% that's different. And both of those things are different marketing strategies, right? Like you can be someone who makes genre games successfully. It's not that you have to necessarily innovate all the time, or even at all, right? If you're paying off a genre well, audiences can be happy with you doing that.
We've talked about like complexity points in games, and you can only buy so much complexity in any sort of a given design. This is almost sort of complexity points in like player expectations, right? Where you can't like bombard people with something too new. And so looking at like Magic the Gathering as a good example is like it was revolutionary 100% when it first came out as being first trading card game. But if on top of it being the first trading card game, it also was like, look at this crazy expansive world with all these weird things that no one can connect to, then it's like, yeah, that might have been a little too weird for people to be on board and connect with.
Well, and you bring up a really good strategy for like revolutionary design is that Magic was an entirely new genre of game, but it leaned very heavily on an established genre of fantasy and D&D, right? Where players would have some kind of internalized knowledge about what these things are that they're playing this game with. Where maybe if Magic had just been abstract shapes or something really off, that it maybe never would have caught on because people didn't have anything to hold on to in terms of the fantasy that they're experiencing. In that way, revolutionary design has a much harder time with the marketing side of things, right? Is that when you're creating a profoundly new experience, how do you communicate what that experience is to players to get them excited about it?
Sometimes it's easy, right? In the video game I guess industry, you'll see this with usually unique hardware, right? So you see Guitar Hero is like, well, that's easy. That's an easy sell. It's very visceral. You can actually see the difference that's going to be playing on a new controller that no other game can play on. But in tabletop games, it's significantly harder because, yeah, usually you need some sort of a new name for your genre, whatever that is. Deck builder was one. Trading card game is one. But that doesn't come around that often.
Yeah, a lot of the space I feel like that we see revolutionary games in is almost in like the physics game space, where you have like, dexterity movement, and you're trying to do a particular action, even if it's like, well, I'm getting a ball in a hole or something, like, okay, well, that's a experience that players have internalized. It's golf, it's, whatever else. Basketball kind of works that way too, right? But this time I'm doing it with this other control mechanism. But like in a board game environment, that could be a particularly revolutionary idea, right? You might be taking something from a different medium almost and then bringing it back into the world in a more abstracted way. Okay, so once you've like settled in on which path you're going down, one, this is not like you chose a path and you're stuck with it, but also how do we go about understanding whether or not what we're doing is resonating with players?
So there's something that, I don't know if Mark Rosewater said this. I feel like it's some popular designer that used this phrase, but players are very good at identifying problems, but not very good at suggesting solutions. I think that's really important to try and recognize when you are testing your particular game. If you're doing something that is like revolutionary, you're probably going to end up getting a lot of feedback from particular players that aren't going to be recognizing what it is that you are trying to do, right? And so if you're trying to do something that is vastly different than conventional norms or from pre-established games in the market, you're probably going to get a lot of pushback. So let's say you're making some sort of an open world game, and the usual sort of established conventions of open world at this point is, well, you probably have some sort of fast travel. There's, I don't know, maybe some sort of quest system or whatever. Let's say you don't want to have fast travel in your game. And a big point of feedback that you get from players is, well, I want fast travel. And that's all they say is like, I wish that there was fast travel. And it's very easy for players to identify that, which is good. But what is incredibly helpful, and I think what designers should focus on, is less so what players are saying and more of how they are feeling. Sometimes the players will tell you how they feel, which is great, right? Because they could say, I want fast travel because this game sucks and it needs fast travel. Or if they say, I want fast travel because I feel like I'm not getting from point A to point B fast enough. From there, you could potentially go a little further and you can ask them like, well, okay, well, why do you feel that way? Maybe it's that they don't feel engaged enough. Maybe there's not enough things that they're running into. They aren't feeling like there's anything worthwhile on their destinations from point A to point B. But you wouldn't know that that is the case without understanding how the player's overall feeling is towards that particular mechanic.
And this comes back to like prescriptive feedback. Players aren't going to know how to particularly give good feedback. They're going to tell you what they're thinking, and they're going to tell you that based on things that they've already experienced. So if you're designing a genre game, that might be helpful, right? Because it might let you know, oh, I'm not meeting genre expectations. There's something missing here from what players are expecting. I need to put that in. But if you're in the evolution or revolution design framework, that kind of feedback might not be nearly as helpful to you, especially if you're trying to push the bounds on what's possible. They might be saying like, oh, well, I wish I could control my character in this way, but that might not be the game you're making. Right. So your job then is to interpret that feedback and figure out a way to satisfy those requests, but at the root cause of what they are, right? Rather than the surface level, oh, I'm used to playing first-person shooters or whatever, so I want to control my character in this way. You have to interpret that as, okay, well, there's something that is unintuitive currently about what I'm doing. What can I do to alleviate that problem without losing sight of the thing I'm actually trying to design?
And I think that the intuition versus unintuitiveness of a mechanic, I think that's a really important thing to point out, is because I think a little anecdotal, it's somewhat of my kind of personal philosophy, but I do feel like a lot of the times when something feels intuitive, it starts to just feel like it belongs in the game, where even if it's not someone's preference, it's less of a general complaint of the mechanic, right? And so sometimes someone might just say like, oh, the combat feels slow, right? Maybe that's their sort of general criticism of the game. And if that's the case, then maybe it's not so much that the combat is slow, but that you aren't selling the general concept or your intention for how you want the combat to be designed.
Right. Or like the fantasy's not paying off, right? Like with Dark Souls, right? You could look at Dark Souls and go, the combat's slow. It's like, well, yeah, it's supposed to be, right? Like,
right. Yeah. It's like the combat's slow because it takes you 4 seconds to swing a giant great hammer or whatever, or a warhammer. Yeah. But if it feels really good to be doing that and it makes sense based off of the visuals, what you're seeing, the weapon that you're holding, etc., but you'd probably see less feedback from people saying that, oh, well, this is slow. Instead, they'd be like, oh, well, you're swinging a warhammer. Like,
well, right. And I think the thing that's scary, right, if you're venturing into like revolutionary design territory, is to get a lot of playtesting feedback that's sort of negative or the people aren't quite understanding what you're doing. And there's this weird, I guess, designer confidence problem, right? Where you might be making an experience that you think is great, but then how do you determine whether or not that's resonating with somebody versus like, are you executing on your idea and it will resonate with some players that get it and the game is made for, or is your idea just not coming across at all, right? And that's like, that's the kind of danger territory, right? Like you might just not be pulling the thing off at all, or you might be testing with people who just aren't your target audience. So determining what those things are, I think, is super important, especially for revolutionary design. And that, like, this is probably why we see it in the indie space more often than anywhere else, is because like a lot of indie designers don't even think about this stuff. They just make the thing, and then it goes out there, and then suddenly it resonates, and it's almost more like a design by what do you want to call it?
Pure love.
No, I just mean like something that filters through to the top, right? It's like the cream of the crop rises to the top, whatever. Like you just put your idea out into the world, not knowing if it's good or not, and you're letting the audience decide after the thing's done, right? That's kind of an indie perspective sometimes. But yeah, I mean, that's, especially if you're investing a lot of time into what you're working on, that's a tough road to walk, right? Like,
right. And unfortunately that sometimes, designers are wrong. Sometimes
Right, exactly.
you could be playing your thing and think that it's great. Everyone else is telling you it's not great, and you go, well, you guys don't understand. And then you put it out, and turns out maybe it's not that great. And I think that's what's really tough about games is that, there's plenty of other I guess mediums that require this, but games in particular really, really require feedback from people. And if you're not careful about filtering that type of feedback, you could end up sort of accepting feedback that maybe actually sort of waters down your intended experience from the beginning, as opposed to uplifts it, right, or embraces whatever it was that your initial intentions were.
I think there's a want from designers for players to tell them exactly what they want, right? Yeah. And the thing to keep in mind is that that can work, but not if you're trying to do anything that is particularly innovative, right? Players' experiences are based on what they've already experienced. Right. So if they're giving you feedback, you always have to remember that it's based on what they've already experienced. It's this is how this other game played. Your game doesn't play that way. I wish it played like this other game.
You could get confirmation bias from these certain games that you played in the past, right? Where you remember a time that you played that game and that game satisfied this thing that you wish this game would satisfy. And so you go, well, that must be the only solution to do that thing, because that is, but you don't even know if that was the reason. It's just because that's the only thing, that's the closest thing you could connect it to.
Yeah, and I think that's partially why player feedback, you need it, but sometimes it's unreliable, right? Their opinion is colored by their previous experiences. And so, they're going to come up with these solutions that are not new and profound, which is, the quote again, right? Players are good at telling you what's wrong, but not good at telling you how to fix it. It's hard to know. I do think that us as designers need to be careful about how we understand player feedback, right? How we understand where their opinions are coming from, making sure they're the right target audience for what we're trying to make, especially in the indie space. I think that's difficult to do. But also in our own design intention. This is I know that this thing that I'm making isn't necessarily going to be liked by everyone, but it'll be loved by a few. And I think that's a guiding principle, especially in the indie space, that makes a ton of sense, because that's the only way that indie can compete, right? We can take these big risky swings where, AAA or whatever that has so much more money invested, but indie can be more nimble.
It's basically if, I don't know, you telling a plumber hey, my toilet's broke, come fix my toilet. And the plumber's just no, you tell me how to fix the toilet and then I'll fix it for you. And I think what's weird is that design as a skill is something that's so hard to quantify and see. And so you end up seeing a lot of players that I'm sure probably maybe a gut reaction would maybe be... maybe not like my metaphor, right? Because it's kind of assuming that you don't know anything, even though you've experienced this thing. But in any other reality, that doesn't make any sense, right? Just because you use a toilet every day doesn't mean you know how to fix it. And I get that it's somewhat different when you're experiencing it, but it is this thing where, yeah, you are very good at being able to pinpoint when it's not working for you. And that's really, really important for the designers. But yeah, I think designers need to be able to have that confidence to understand when to take that feedback and when to leave it behind. When you start playing Elden Ring and you run into the dude with the shield and all the swords.
Scion guy.
Yeah. And you die right away. If the majority of players were oh, I didn't like that I died just now. I didn't get it. I don't understand. And they went, oh, the majority of players didn't understand. So we should probably get rid of that. That didn't make sense. That's when you are taking direct feedback, right? That's when you're taking the proposed solutions from players and using that and
one-to-one. Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, I feel like that's not enough confidence with your initial intentionality.
It's interesting that you bring up a correct solution, right? Where, obviously a solution that works could be considered correct, but it might not be the best solution, right? And then I think from an art perspective, we're used to living in a world where there are many correct solutions, and it's just figuring out which correct solution is actually the best one for this particular project, this particular moment.
It's it's not finding perfection, right? Because I think that there's a lot of people that treat design in that way. That it's like, well, if I have these mechanics, right, I'm gonna make the perfect card game.
Yeah,
like, and it's like, well, that's not how that works.
Right,
like,
right. Well, yeah, we were talking in the Discord a little bit earlier today, and someone mentioned something about making sort of a really good generic system, and I was like, well, yeah, you can make a generic system that works, but it will never be as good as a specific system to execute a specific experience. The one I would bring up was Grimdark, because Dark Souls, but I was basically like, if you design a Grimdark system, that will always deliver a better Grimdark experience than a generic system sort of masquerading as Grimdark, right? Like, you might be able to put on that hat or whatever, but it will never be able to achieve that sort of level of experience. And you can substitute Grimdark with anything, right? That just happens to be one genre. But like that you're never going to make a system that will be able to pull that off as well as one that's specifically tailored to that experience.
And I think you can actually see this with games that are expansive games. And so a good example of this is like Magic the Gathering. At its core is about conflict. But because its core is so generic in a way, it is expansive, and we're seeing all sorts of different stories and expansions that are told. Generally, it's around conflict, but if we use something like Innistrad to connect it as close as possible to something like Grimdark, there's ways of trying to express the flavor through the mechanics and try to have the system work in favor of that type of a narrative. But yeah, it's never going to be as good as something that is directly facilitating that experience, like you're saying. And I mean, not that we have anything to use as an example, but let's say you compare it to a different card game, something like Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood, I think, is very good at delivering its very specific feeling, which is this sort of war of attrition, right? It's you slowly becoming weaker as you're losing more and more of your armor and your gear, and you're sort of beating each other up and punching each other. That's what that system is designed around. It makes it much less expansive narratively than something like Magic, but it does fulfill a very specific feeling.
The last thing I would bring up on this point is, as a independent designer, you're not going to be like, Magic already exists, right? We already have the sort of generic fantasy trading card game. So why you should not be approaching, I'm just going to make a better generic fantasy trading card game, right? That's not going to work. Right? You need to be able to produce a different experience.
It has to be significantly different.
Right. And this is at least evolutionary design. Could be revolutionary. Right? Depends on what your goals as a designer are.
If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to give us a little like and subscribe, maybe a comment down below. Also, feel free to join our Discord. You can find a link to that in the description down below.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye now. Bye.
I thought maybe today we would talk about games.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just today, though.
So
back to games tomorrow.
Oh, okay.